When Emily Carter boarded Flight 542, she longed for one thing: a quiet seat where she could finally breathe after a grueling work trip. But peace wasn't on the itinerary that day. Moments after settling into her seat, she felt the sharp sting of unwelcome eyes burning into her. Across the aisle sat a middle-aged man, his piercing glare paired with a scowl so intense it seemed permanently etched into his face. It didn't take long for his displeasure to boil over. His muttered words, sharp and pointed, were just loud enough to carry. Though they weren't meant to be heard, they hung in the air like a toxic fog, impossible to ignore. Emily, visibly drained from her travels, refused to flinch. She had faced this kind of hostility before, countless times, and had learned how to mask the emotional bruises it left behind. Her composure remained intact, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her like a heavy stone. The man's irritation quickly escalated. He snapped his seatbelt open, rising with the kind of exaggerated flair that ensured everyone noticed. Storming down the aisle, he waved his arms at the flight attendants, his voice rising with each step. "She shouldn't be here," he barked, his words echoing through the cabin. His tone, drenched in entitlement, demanded attention. Passengers turned their heads, some curious, others uneasy. The tension in the cabin thickened, suffocating the faint hum of conversation. Emily felt her pulse quicken, but she reminded herself to stay calm. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. Instead of pleading or reacting in anger, Emily reached for her phone. One call, she thought, would be enough. As she dialed, her movements were deliberate and steady, her resolve as firm as steel. She had no way of knowing then, but what she did next would set a chain of events into motion that would ripple far beyond this flight. The man, emboldened by the lack of immediate intervention, raised his voice even further. "This is ridiculous. Move her. She's ruining my flight. Better yet, take her off the plane." His words were a venomous mixture of arrogance and prejudice. Emily's grip on the armrest tightened, her knuckles white. Exhausted as she was, she wouldn't let him dictate her worth. Years of enduring moments like these had taught her to remain outwardly composed, even as anger and frustration brewed beneath the surface. The flight attendants arrived, their faces strained with unease. One leaned toward Emily, her voice low and apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Is there anything we can do to make this easier for you?" Emily's response was calm but firm, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "I'm fine where I am, thank you." She refused to let the man's anger dictate her dignity or displace her. The man, now emboldened by his growing audacity, sneered. "Oh, so we're just going to let her ruin everything? Great." Typical. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some glanced at Emily with sympathy, but no one said a word. The silence was deafening, a painful reminder of how often complicity disguised itself as neutrality. Emily's fingers hovered over her phone as her mind raced. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for something bigger. The man continued his tirade, his voice rising like a storm. "What are you even doing?" he snapped. "Call whoever you want. You're still the problem here." Emily's gaze remained steady, her defiance quiet but unyielding. She dialed a number and spoke in a calm, measured tone. "This is Emily Carter. I need assistance." Passengers nearby leaned in, pretending disinterest while straining to hear. The man's expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering across his face. Still, his arrogance didn't waver. "Assistance? What kind of nonsense is this?" Before long, the captain's voice interrupted the growing tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been made aware of a situation in the cabin. Please remain seated as we address this matter." The announcement silenced even the boldest whispers. The man looked around, his smug confidence faltering for the first time. Moments later, two uniformed airline officials entered the cabin. Their presence radiated authority, and their purposeful strides made it clear they weren't there to negotiate. One of them addressed Emily directly. "Miss Carter, are you all right?" Emily nodded, her voice calm but resolute. "Yes, thank you." Before the man could interject, the second official turned toward him. "Sir, Your behavior has created an unsafe environment for passengers and crew. We're asking you to leave this aircraft immediately." The man's face turned crimson. "Me? Are you serious? She's the problem, not me." The official's tone hardened. "You can leave voluntarily, or we can escalate this further. The choice is yours." Realizing he was outnumbered, the man grabbed his bag, muttering under his breath as he stormed off. His parting words dripped with venom. "You'll regret this." Emily held his gaze, her quiet strength unshaken. A ripple of applause spread through the cabin, though Emily didn't acknowledge it. Her mind was already on the next steps. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Emily sent a quick message to Daniel Brooks, a trusted civil rights attorney. She knew this was far from over. What had started as a moment of blatant prejudice was about to become a catalyst for something far greater. As Flight 542 soared into the clouds, the cabin gradually settled. Yet Emily Carter's thoughts raced faster than the jet engines. She replayed the confrontation in her mind, the man's hateful words echoing like distant thunder. But now, her focus wasn't on the sting of his prejudice. It was on the action she had already set into motion. Daniel Brooks, one of the most formidable civil rights attorneys in the country, was already working behind the scenes. By the time the plane touched down, he had contacted the airline's corporate office, demanding swift and decisive action. Emily trusted Daniel's expertise, knowing he would treat this incident not as an isolated event, but as part of a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. Unbeknownst to Emily, a fellow passenger had recorded the entire incident on their phone. The video captured the man's explosive tirade, his sharp words laced with entitlement, and Emily's unwavering composure. Within hours of landing, the footage began to circulate online. It started small, a few retweets, some shares on Facebook, but by the next morning, it had gone viral. Social media erupted in outrage. Hashtags like #JusticeForEmily and #AccountabilityNow trended across platforms as people from all walks of life shared their own stories of discrimination and hostility in public spaces. Emily's calm but firm defiance resonated deeply with thousands who had endured similar moments of injustice. The man's identity was uncovered almost immediately. As his face and name became public, the backlash was swift and unforgiving. His employer, a prominent corporation, issued a statement condemning his behavior and terminated his employment within 24 hours. News outlets picked up the story, and the man became a symbol of unchecked prejudice and its consequences. Meanwhile, the airline faced mounting pressure. Activists, advocacy groups, and ordinary citizens flooded their social media pages with demands for accountability. The airline issued a formal apology to Emily, acknowledging their failure to handle the situation promptly and banning the man from flying with their carrier indefinitely. But for Emily, an apology wasn't enough. With Daniel by her side, she pushed for systemic changes. They demanded improved staff training, stricter policies against discrimination, and clear consequences for passengers who created hostile environments. "It's not about punishing one person," Emily told Daniel during a late-night call. "It's about ensuring no one else has to go through this." Their efforts began to gain traction. The airline announced a partnership with civil rights organizations to develop comprehensive training programs for their staff. They also pledged to implement an anti-discrimination policy that would set a new standard for the industry. But Emily's fight didn't end there. The incident had opened a floodgate of stories from others who had experienced prejudice on flights. Inspired by her courage, countless individuals began sharing their experiences, amplifying the movement Emily had unknowingly sparked. Weeks later, Emily stood at the center of a rally for justice and inclusion, her voice echoing through the crowd. The event had drawn hundreds, their faces a sea of hope and determination. Emily's heart swelled as she stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment heavy yet invigorating. "What happened to me wasn't unique," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But it's time we stop accepting it as normal. Everyone deserves to feel safe and respected, no matter where they are." The crowd erupted into applause, their collective energy electrifying. Among them was a young girl in the front row, her wide eyes locked on Emily with admiration. For a moment, Emily paused, the sight of the girl stirring something deep within her. This fight, she realized, wasn't just for the present, it was for the future, for those who needed to see that change was possible. After the rally, Emily reflected on the whirlwind of events that had unfolded since that fateful flight. The man's parting words, "You'll regret this," played in her mind, but now they felt almost laughable. She had no regrets, only resolve. Through her actions, Emily had transformed a moment of pain and injustice into a movement of hope and accountability. The journey was far from over, but the ripples of her courage were undeniable. She had not only reclaimed her dignity, but had also inspired countless others to do the same. As she walked away from the podium that day, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but she was ready. For herself, for the young girl in the front row, and for every person who had ever been silenced, Emily vowed to keep fighting. She wouldn't stop until the world she envisioned, a world of respect, dignity, and inclusion, became a reality.